The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, and thank you everyone for joining us today. You've logged on to the Nelson Labs webinar, Packaging Validation 101, Part 2, Process Validation. Now, if you've missed Part 1 of our Packaging Validation 101, you can go back onto the Nelson Labs website under the Education link and then on-demand webinars, and you can find the Packaging Validation 101 on-demand version. Now, if you miss any of our webinars or would simply like to refer back to any of them, including this one in the future, you can always find them on the Nelson Labs website under that link, On Demand Webinars page listed under the Education tab. You can also receive new notifications of upcoming live and on-demand webinars by liking Nelson Labs on Facebook or following on LinkedIn or Twitter. Nelson Labs is a leading global provider of laboratory testing and expert advisory services for the medtech and pharmaceutical companies. The company performs over 800 rigorous microbiological and analytical laboratory tests across the medical device, pharmaceutical, and protective barrier industries. The experts at Nelson know every test matters and requires solutions to complex problems to improve patient outcomes and minimize client risk. So let's get started. Today we're joined by Jennifer Gigi, expert technical consultant at Nelson Labs. Jennifer has over 25 years of medical device laboratory experience. She has worked in the microbiology, bioburden, microbial identifications, and packaging sections at Nelson Labs. Jennifer has experience in various microbial tests, including microbial limits, plate counts, biological indicator population verification, organism IDs, and bioburden tests. Jennifer has spent the last 15 years working in our packaging group. As one of the original packaging group members at Nelson Labs, Jennifer was heavily involved in validating all the packaging test methods and equipment and writing the test procedures for packaging tests performed at Nelson Labs. Jennifer is a participating member of the ASTM F02 Committee for Packaging and is registered as a specialist microbiologist with ASM. So now to begin today's presentation, I turn the time over to Jennifer.
Thanks, Mike. Well, let's get started. Here's the agenda for today's webinar. We will start by reviewing ISO 11607, which is the packaging standard. Then we'll go through some validation basics to gain an understanding of what we're trying to accomplish with the process validation and why it's important. Then we'll dive into defining the process, which is where the validation starts. Next, we'll talk about equipment IQ, OQ, and PQ, which is the sealer qualification. Then we talk about contract packagers. And finally, we end with some thoughts on routine monitoring of the process to ensure it remains in control. ISO 11607 underwent a major rewrite in 2006 and was split into two parts, becoming the comprehensive packaging standard that we have today. Before this, there wasn't really a documented process for running packaging validations. As such, companies each had to invent their own wheel, so to speak, and to come up with their own validation plan. Some of these validations were very robust and others not so much. Since its update in 2006, the world has very specific guidance on what validations need to include and how to do them, though the standard is very open and there are a lot of options available for validation tests. ISO 11607 is divided into those two parts. Part 1 is how to make and validate sterile barrier packaging, and Part 2 is how to perform packaging process validation. Today we're focused on Part 2, but we covered Part 1 in a separate webinar, so if you haven't seen that one, I'd encourage you to do so, and Mike gave you the information on where to find that on our website. There's also a guidance document on how to interpret and use ISO 11607, which is ISO 16775. And I would recommend purchasing both for your company library. These are essential documents to have if you're making sterile medical devices. What is a validation? Well, validation is the action of proving the validity or accuracy of something. In the case of a packaging validation, we're proving the sterile barrier system does in fact provide a microbial barrier through the labeled shelf life. In the case of a packaging process validation, we are proving the sterile barrier system we use to package the device will always be the same quality and consistency. The process validation tells us that the packaging starts out in that good condition, and the packaging validation tells us that it will continue to be good as it ages. We validate to prove that we can do something the same over and over, day after day, so that the output is identical every time. Let's look at a random product to illustrate the basic concepts of process validation. Let's say I make a lighthouse. I want to validate my manufacturing process so I know that each lighthouse I produce will be identical. In my slide here, I have a bunch of lighthouses that I made. At first glance, they may all look the same, but a closer examination shows that I have one that's slightly larger, and there's one that's somehow a palm tree instead of a lighthouse, but with the same base. Since no process will ever be 100% accurate, we need to have a sound understanding of what the range of variability is in the process and what the possible failure points could be. In this case, my process is about 90% accurate, or 90% of my process outputs are meeting the exact lighthouse specifications. And this plays into sample size. The lower the failure rate, the less likely it will be detected with a small sample size. You also need to consider the failure points and how impactful they may be to the final product. When I look at possible failure points in my lighthouse example, I have two: the size discrepancy and the palm tree. I don't think a consumer would be too upset if they get a larger lighthouse. The lighthouse still looks and functions the same, so the consumer should still be happy, and this may not be an impactful failure. The palm tree, however, might be a disappointment to someone who needed a lighthouse. So that would probably be an unacceptable failure. If I can consider the first failure mode as acceptable, then I can probably raise my process accuracy up to 95%. The next step would be to figure out how and why I got those defects and try to prevent them from happening in the future. Once the process is optimized, meaning that I understand it and I've worked out all the bugs, then I would validate it. Once the validation is complete, I need a monitoring plan in place to ensure nothing is changing in the process that would change my output. Validation and qualification are two related terms and are sometimes used interchangeably, but they are different. Both involve testing and gathering data and evidence that something can be done repeatedly over and over again with the same outcome. The difference has to do with what is being proven. Qualification is the act of gathering data or evidence that equipment or a system is working as expected. We qualify equipment, facilities, people, and systems to show that these components individually are working. Once we have all the parts qualified, we can then put those together and validate the whole process. Now, there's a bit of gray area here and there, and some things can fall into both categories. Regardless of whether it's a qualification or a validation, the exercise needs to be repeated periodically, and the frequency of revalidation or requalification will depend on risk and should be included in the validation plan, meaning you decide ahead of time how often you will revalidate and state why that interval is appropriate for your case. The first step in the validation process is to understand what you're validating. The best way to start is by mapping the process using a cross-functional team. Having people on the team from different areas will help you to get a more complete picture, since everyone sees the process from their own vantage point. The frontline operator is going to have a different perspective than the engineer who designed the process or the manager or quality person who monitor the process. And all these inputs are valuable. Once you have all the process steps laid out, go back and decide where things can go wrong and identify the possible failure points. Define the critical steps and look at whether you can add in some in-process checks, especially those critical steps to detect the expected failure points. For my lighthouse example, since my failure is a palm tree top instead of a lighthouse, I might add an inspection to the top components prior to assembly. Or better yet, make sure the assembly equipment is physically incapable of using the palm tree, so I don't have to rely on a human doing a visual check. During the process mapping, focus on the why behind the process and make sure you're digging deep enough to really understand everything. The old school checkbox approach of going through a list and marking each item off doesn't really help you to understand what's going on behind the scenes. And a sound understanding of the process will really help to troubleshoot later on when something goes wrong. Remember, quality is built into a process, not something you inspect for at the end. Now that we understand the process, it's a good time to get some test data to help us set acceptance criteria that are meaningful and applicable. Not only do we want criteria for any in-process steps, but for the final process output as well. Here, it's important to really know what the limits of the process are and how good is good enough. That starts by defining what is acceptable. For my lighthouse example, my acceptance criteria may be that the base is water and the top is a lighthouse. This would be enough to differentiate my acceptable lighthouse from the unacceptable palm tree. I may also add that the water is blue and the lighthouse is red, if that's part of my design specification. I could also say that the size needs to fall within a certain measurement, but if size doesn't matter, then you shouldn't have an acceptance criteria around it. In my lighthouse example, I already determined that the extra large lighthouse was acceptable, so in this case, I wouldn't want a size specification. Acceptance criteria should be meaningful, applicable, and specific for each application. I can run some development or feasibility studies to help me understand the process by challenging individual process parameters, and then seeing how changing one variable at a time will affect the final output. In developing my seal strength specification, I might want to seal samples at increasing temperatures and check the peel strength to find the relationship between temperature and strength. These graphs from ISO 16775 show a heat seal curve analysis that was used to develop a processing window as the high and low temperatures that gave a consistent seal strength. The graph on the top is the curve for seal strength. As the temperature is increased, the seal strength increases until it plateaus. This flat area on the curve is the ideal processing window for this material combination. Visual assessment is also valuable in the design stages, for a quick check. The graph on the bottom also includes a visual assessment curve, which shows both the visual acceptance and the seal strength acceptance, and they seem to overlap very nicely in this example. In this case, the visual check could be used as a predictor that the seal strength will fall into the desired range, since the correlation between the visual criteria and the measured seal strength has been shown in this design study. I need some process limits to let me know when I'm getting close to being unacceptable, or maybe already crossed that threshold. Back to the lighthouse example. If the specification is that the water is blue and the lighthouse is red, then what tolerance do I have around blue? What is too dark and what is too light? And how will I measure the color to know that it's in the right range? And what will I do if I exceed my limit? We also want to optimize the process, which means looking at where things can go wrong and doing something to make sure that doesn't happen. Maybe the equipment needs fine-tuning to run at peak efficiency and accuracy. Maybe there's a bottleneck somewhere in the process that needs attention. Maybe you find a critical point that you missed and you need to reevaluate. Maybe you discover some improvements that you can make to ensure the process is as efficient and accurate as possible. ISO 11607 says you need to have a process specification for the forming, assembly, and sealing of the packaging. Forming specifications could be as simple as documenting the preformed pouch that you'll use, including the size, the materials, and the vendor or part number. If you're forming the packaging in-house from sheet or roll stock, you would want to specify the materials used, including the thickness or the material grade and the specifics on the material composition, in addition to specifications on the final packaging, including size and shape and seal width. For assembly, you'd include things like how the device is placed into the packaging. For example, if a handle needs to be grabbed first, it should be oriented to be near the opening so it can be grabbed without completely opening the package. You should also define the protective packaging. Are you using a shelf carton? If you are, what's it made of and how big is it? How is the pouch or tray placed into the carton? How many units are going into your shipper box? How are those oriented within the box? What size and construction is your shipper box? And what additional fillers, if any, are you going to use? If you use bubble wrap, how much do you add and where does it go? The point here is to define the assembly so that it can always be done the same. That way we know that we are always producing the exact product that we validated. The sealing specifications are the combination of temperature, dwell time, and pressure, which will be used for sealing. This includes the high and low for the range and the nominal settings, which will be used for production. These specifications will be proven and validated later, but during the pre-work or design phase of the validation, these details should be narrowed down to what will be validated. Some packaging processes are more manual and some are more automated. We aren't going to go into too many details since the process itself will be company specific. ISO 11607 focuses mostly on the sealer qualification part of the process, and since all packages need to be sealed at some point, everyone will have a sealer that needs to be qualified. The sealer qualification follows the traditional IQ, OQ, PQ method. The first step is to write the validation protocol, where we document the test plan or what we're doing, why we're doing it, and what we're expecting the outcome to be, or our acceptance criteria. We need to know what the sealer capabilities are, what variables can be changed, and what equipment requirements there are so we can incorporate them into our protocol. The purpose of a sealer qualification is to ensure that all seals made on the sealer are continuous, without gaps, and are sufficiently strong for the intended use. We will verify the samples are continuous by seal integrity testing, and we will verify the seals are sufficiently strong by seal strength testing. The sample size for testing needs to be based on statistically valid rationale per the guidance in ISO 11607. We did cover sample size in more detail in the packaging validation webinar on ISO 11607 Part 1, and we also covered more details on the test methods that we're using for the sealer qualification in that Part 1 webinar. So we won't go into those in depth in this one. For seal integrity, the preferred test is dye migration. This method is capable of detecting seal gaps as small as 50 microns. Since we're only looking at the seal in this validation, we want to use the more sensitive seal test. So dye migration is preferred over bubble. For seal strength, the preferred method is peel testing to determine the peel force required to open a section of the seal. Peel is preferred over burst because it's testing a uniform coupon that can be directly compared to other peel data. We can also test multiple locations on the sealer to ensure there is an even seal strength. This might include pulling multiple coupons from a long seal on a large package, or sealing packages at the left, center, and right ends of the sealing bar, and then cutting a coupon from each small pouch to see that if the strength is the same. And this type of a study would show that regardless of where on the sealer the seal was made, you would get the same seal strength. And it's probably more important if the packages will be sealed manually, where placement on the sealer can be more varied. A visual inspection element is often added to document the visual characteristics of the seal are acceptable, but visual inspection alone would not be sufficient to demonstrate seal integrity. Okay, now that we have selected our test methods, we need to set our acceptance criteria. Integrity is the easiest. The seal needs to be continuous without gaps to ensure that no microbes can get through, so we should have a 100% pass rate on the dye test. The peel specification is a bit more tricky. You need acceptance criteria to qualify the sealer, but you don't know what the actual minimum seal strength value for the product will be until much later. We can pick a value based on experience or published data on the expected seal strength of the material. Or we can do some R&D on how changing the sealer variables affects the seal strength, as we discussed in the last slide. The objective of the sealer qualification is to show that the sealer can make good and consistent seals, not that we can get a certain seal strength number. We can create a product-specific minimum peel value for the packaging validation once we know what the typical values are from the sealer qualification. And then we can verify those values are sufficient to keep the package closed with the product during the packaging validation. In addition to a minimum seal value, you may want to consider a specification around the standard deviation of the peel force. A good sealer should be able to produce a set of seals with a tight standard deviation. If the peel force values are all over the board, it shows that you're making inconsistent seals and your sealer is unreliable, which means that your sterile barrier packages will not be reliable. Remember, the point of the validation is to prove that we can get the same output over and over. So if the seal strength is inconsistent, we aren't meeting the validation objective. A minimum seal width specification should also be included in the protocol. EN 8688-5 says that seals shall not be less than 6 millimeters, and for rib seals, the sum of the widths of the ribs shall not be less than 6 millimeters. Since seal width is dictated by the sealer, be sure to purchase one that makes seals at least 6 millimeters wide, but depending on your device, you may need even a wider seal. If you have a visual inspection element in your validation, you need to list the expected defects and clearly define them. It is best to keep the defect list short and specific and only include defects that are relevant. Visual inspection is a good tool to make sure seals look good before committing to dye testing, and it can be very valuable if you're sending the samples to an outside lab and you want to make sure that the samples you're sending are going to be good samples. Just as a note here, Nelson Labs Advisory Services writes sealer qualification protocols and summary reports, and if that's a service you're interested in, just contact us. The IQ, or installation qualification, is where we are documenting the equipment installation. This includes ensuring that all the utility requirements were met. So you need to ask questions like, what are the power requirements for the sealer? How much space does the sealer need for proper ventilation? Are there options like gas fill or vacuum draw that need to be installed or require special utilities? Does the sealer require emergency power backup? Does the sealer connect to a computer? Is there special software to control the sealer that needs to be included in the validation or maybe validated separately? The protocol should contain a list of what needs to be checked, and then those items are verified and documented during the IQ. Your IQ needs to be performed initially and whenever the sealer is moved or the utility connections are altered. The OQ, or operational qualification, is where we test out all the settings and features on the sealer. If the sealer has variable settings, verify that you can change them. If there's safety features, challenge them to see if they work as advertised. In essence, you make sure that everything operates as it should. The OQ also includes the initial calibration of the sealer. And this is where you would want to write up a calibration and maintenance schedule for the equipment to make sure that it is checked for continuing compliance and given the periodic attention that it needs to keep performing as expected. The operator training is also documented in the OQ, and it's a good time to develop some kind of standardized training for future operators. The final key point is to determine the acceptable range of sealing for the specific package or the intended processing window. This is usually done by starting with a recommended setting and going up or down from there to see how that affects the seal. This is done either by performing peel testing on each setting to get the seal strength value or evaluating the visual appearance of the seal. You then pick a high, a nominal, and a low based on the seal strengths and or visual aesthetics. You can also just take the pouch manufacturer recommended sealing parameters and add a plus or minus of 2 to 5 degrees and create a processing window, and then test to verify that that window works. We've been asked if you need product in the packaging or if you can use empty packages for the sealer qualification. Well, the answer is you can use empty packages, since the purpose of the sealer qualification is to show your sealer can make good seals, and that's really independent of the product. However, you must include the product in the packaging validation, as we discussed in the Part 1 webinar, and that will show that your packaging can be sealed properly with the product inside. Once you have the processing window selected, then you verify the quality of the seals using the seal integrity and seal strength tests at the high, the nominal, and the low settings. If you can show that you have acceptable data through the processing window, meaning we make good seals at the low and the high ends, then we can move to the PQ. If there are failures, then we need to investigate to determine what happened and why. If the high or the low end fails, then we can adjust the processing window and start over. The PQ, or performance qualification, is where we challenge the ruggedness and repeatability of the process. Here, we need to make samples on multiple days to show that day after day we can get the same seal quality. We also want to add in multiple operators to show that regardless of who is pushing the buttons, we will get the same final product. We need to seal all samples at the same settings, so the only variable is the operator or the day of testing. That way, we can make a good comparison of the data. Since we've already shown that the seals are continuous and sufficiently strong for the whole processing window, we will seal our samples at either the nominal or the normal production sealer settings. Or if you want to create a worst case scenario, then you would seal at the low settings. We will test the seals for seal integrity and seal strength as we did in the OQ. And if the acceptance criteria in the protocol are met, then we can write up our validation report. Sometimes companies subcontract part or all of the packaging process to a contract packager. If you're using a contract packager, here are some helpful tips to remember. Even though the contract packager is doing the actual packaging, you are still responsible for meeting all the requirements in ISO 11607, or in this case, ensuring that they were met by the contract packager. Make sure the contract packager has a quality system in place that is appropriate for the medical device or pharma industry, and that they have the relevant expertise in sterile barrier packaging and are familiar with the degree of regulatory compliance expected of our industry. Make sure they have change control procedures in place and will notify you of any changes that they make so that you can assess what impact those changes may have to your product and validation. Verify they have validations in place for the equipment and process that meet the requirements in ISO 11607. And make sure they have calibration and maintenance schedules for their equipment. Once the validation is complete, we need to turn our attention to process monitoring. The validation showed that we can make good seals initially. Process monitoring shows that we can continue to make those same quality seals even as the equipment gets old and as we get new operators. The monitoring plan should be written down and clearly defined. How will we monitor and when will we do so? The testing frequency and sample size should be included with a rationale. ISO 11607 says that there should be a process monitoring, but it doesn't specify how to monitor or how often to do it. There's a lot of consideration that goes into deciding what are appropriate monitoring tests and intervals. If you have the equipment internally, it's easier to test more frequently, maybe with every production run or every day of production. You can also get results immediately, so manufacturing decisions can be made on the spot. You may want to consider either purchasing some equipment or investing in a correlation study to show that a test you can do each day relates to a more complex test that you perform with less frequency at an outside lab. The example with the graphs of peel strength versus visual characteristics would be an example of how a correlation study could be done to show the relationship of an easy test like visual inspection to a test that required specialized equipment like seal strength. If you do decide to implement internal testing, remember to factor in all the costs, including the initial cost of the equipment, the cost to qualify the equipment, to calibrate and maintain the equipment, to validate the test method, train employees, and maintain the expertise to keep the equipment operational. The sealer can be monitored using the same tests that we used in the sealer qualification, since we have acceptance criteria and a baseline expectation from the validation data. Or if you choose, you can set up some other tests and establish new acceptance criteria, since ISO 11607 doesn't specify what testing is required. In addition to the sealer, you will want to monitor other parts of the process. Look at the failure points that you identified in the process mapping and development stages and see what in-process checks you should put into place. Some of these failure points may need monitoring, depending on what steps were taken to minimize or eliminate them. As a general rule, a more mature process may require less monitoring if it has remained in control for a long time, where a new and unproven process may require more monitoring until it is established. If a change occurs in the process or if negative trends are identified, it would be appropriate to increase the monitoring interval until you have confidence the process is under control. When should you revalidate? Well, anytime you make a change, big or small, you need to assess what impact that change will have to your validation and address whether additional testing or revalidation is needed to confirm that the change did not affect the original validation or your process output. Some changes may be covered with just a paper assessment. Some may need an assessment and some confirmatory testing to show the change did not have an impact. Some changes may require the whole validation to be repeated. The validation plan should also include routine revalidation based on a pre-established time interval. This is usually just a periodic check of the validation and changes made since the validation and a comparison to current standards. As validation standards update, older validations may no longer be compliant and may need to be repeated. Well, that wraps up process validation according to ISO 11607 Part 2. Here's my contact information for anyone who needs it. And just as a reminder, if you have any questions that you wanted, please get those submitted into the chat now. Nelson Labs and Sterigenics offer webinars and other educational resources on a number of sterilization and medical device and pharma testing topics. So if you'd like to learn more on topics like we presented today, please check out these websites. And with that last piece of business, I think we're ready for our Q&A. So I'll send it back to you, Mike.
Thanks, Jennifer. And we thank you for your insights and for all the great information that you presented today and have given us and the audience a lot to think about. And yes, we do have received some questions while you were presenting that we'd like to address now. If we don't get to your specific question, Jennifer would be happy to address it individually after we conclude today. So let's go ahead and start with our first question. Here's the first one, Jen. If there are multiple tests that apply to the product, how do we decide on which tests to do and how many are sufficient?
Oh, that's a good question, Mike. Um, it's also one that's going to get a very general answer because all decisions that we really make in the industry are going to be based on risk and on cost and balancing those two. The higher the risk, the more you need to invest in it, the more testing you need to do. The lower the risk, you probably don't need to do as much testing. And then at some point, you need to balance the cost. Yeah, you cannot spend so much money and resources on testing that you consume all the products you produce and you have nothing left to sell. So this is where I would start in trying to look at creating a testing plan, is to just look at what you're trying to prove, decide what test will meet the objective of what you're trying to prove. Like in our Lighthouse example, where we had a failure mode that we identified that was unacceptable, being that palm tree top, I would say, what test would I need to verify that I don't have any of those palm trees coming through my assembly line? Figure out what that test is, and then start from there in developing the plan. If there's any more specific to that question, I think that would probably be really good to be addressed individually.
Great, thanks, Jennifer. Okay, so here's our next question. Is there a published standard that should be used when performing visual inspection?
There is a standard. ASTM has a standard, ASTM F1886, that's on visual inspection. It really is specific as a packaging test, and it's for package sterile barrier packaging. You're looking for channels. There's also a list of optional things in the appendix, like overseal, non-homogeneous, wrinkles, underseal, narrow seals, things like that. So it's really geared towards sterile barrier packaging. That's the only one that I know of. I do know that that the visual inspection standard is undergoing a revision right now, and they're looking at bringing some of those things that are kind of in the appendix into the, and defining things a little differently. As far as other types of inspection, like in-process inspection that you would do, there isn't really a standard for those. People will reference the 1886 one, but it's really just because it's so open-ended and there's all these options you could do. But you'd really want to define all those criteria internally, because they're going to be specific, and you're not going to find a standard that's going to tell you exactly how to do a box inspection or how to do an in-process inspection. But you can use the 1886 for post-sealing. I know that's very common, that people will do a 100% inspection as they're coming off the line, and those types of seal defects would be included in the ASTM F 1886.
All right, thank you again, Jennifer. Here's our next question. How do you go about choosing a sample size? And we might have covered this in part one of our couple weeks ago, but why don't we cover that quickly again?
We did cover it quite a bit in part one. So if you want some more details on that, then go back and watch that. But just to recap really quickly, sample size guidance that we have is really that it needs to be statistically valid and that it should be risk-based. So those are kind of the two things that we look for when determining a sample size. And there's a lot of options for how to do that. There are some expectations out there. Just kind of to give you a benchmark, a sample size of 3 is going to be very hard. Probably a sample size of 13 is going to be very hard to get through some regulatory bodies, because the expectations are that they would be much higher. But there are some instances where you might be able to make a rationale for a 3 or a 13 if you have some special circumstances and you can come up with a good rationale. but generally speaking, notified bodies are looking for larger sample sizes, particularly the FDA. When you're deciding on the sample size, it's not necessarily that there's a magic number. What's more important is your rationale and your reasoning for why that number is appropriate. And so that's why we tell people to have a documented sampling plan. You should have a sample rationale that explains why the number is statistically relevant and appropriate for your particular application. And again, it should be based on risk.
Thanks, Jennifer.
Lower risk could get a lower sample size, higher risk might need a higher one.
Thank you, Jennifer. And again, we did cover that in part 1, and you can always review that part, that on-demand version of the webinar on the Nelson site. So let's get to the next question. Here it is, Jennifer. Is there a difference between equipment OQ and process OQ in terms of sterile packaging?
Is there a difference? Again, that could really depend. Again, because a packaging process can be very different. Some packaging processes could be very manual, where you have somebody that's doing a run of a few hundred parts, and they are taking product from a bin, putting it in a preformed sterile barrier pouch, and manually taking it over and sealing on a sealer. That's one end of the spectrum. The other end of the spectrum would be to have an on-site packaging machine that's doing the forming and assembly and sealing all in one, where you have product coming in through one hopper, you have roll stock coming in through another end, and the packages being formed and filled and sealed all in one, and you have all these components coming in, and your final output is a sealed product. That's a very automated process. So how you would look at each one of those would be very different.
Great, thanks, Jennifer. I think we have time for one more question. So here you go. How can Nelson help with establishing a worst-case family of products for package validation?
Okay, we did cover that in the part 1 webinar. We talked about family grouping and worst case, and things that you would consider when trying to group certain products together for packaging. And so I would encourage whoever asked that question to go back and refresh on that. But just to give a quick recap, you're looking at things that that make the family similar from a packaging perspective. So typically, a family is going to have the same sterile barrier system. Maybe it's a different size, but it's the same components that make up the sterile barrier system. Then once you've decided what goes into your family and you've rationalized why they are similar enough to be considered a family, then you would look at who is your worst case representative. And for packaging, that would be the product that presents the worst case challenge to the packaging. And there are a number of things that you would want to look at to decide who is the worst case. It's not always cut and dry. Sometimes it is, but it's not always, oh, it's just the biggest one. You need to look at a number of different things like size, like the ratio of size to the seal. How many fitments? What's the shape? Do I have any sharp edges or corners? If I have a smooth and I have a sharp, well, even if the smooth one is bigger, maybe the sharp one ends up being my worst case. So there's a lot of different variables to look at and consider. And Nelson Technical Consulting can definitely help with that. That is a service that we provide.
Okay. Well, thank you, Jennifer. We thank you for that thorough and informative presentation. I do want to reiterate that part 1 of this two-part series is on the Nelson Labs website under the Education on Demand section, and this recording will be available in the next day or two on the Nelson Labs website in the same location. Again, I'd like to thank our presenter, Jennifer Gigi, for her insights, and I'd like to thank you, the viewer, for attending this session. And we hope that you found it to be a valuable experience. We thank you and have a great rest of your day.